Hello, students. I'm back, and we are going to be talking about how England and France and the rest of the powerful states of Europe were organized once the Hundred Years' War was over, and how things changed really during the 14th century as far as the political landscape. So before the 14th century, there weren't really a whole lot of powerful national monarchs. Mostly it had been kings that had been constantly at war with nobles and vice versa. And kings often, borders were really kind of vague, borders changed all the time as countries took over each other and armies invaded each other. So let's take a look at how this all kind of changes, and it starts to become a much more solid national monarchy model during the 14th century. Okay, so first let's go with England. So Edward III, remember him? He was the one whose mother was Isabella, the Queen of France, or Princess of France. His dad was Edward II of England. His mom and her lover overthrew his dad, and then he was like the living embodiment. And he had been involved in the Hundred Years' War, or at least the cause of it. He went on to actually reign for 50 years, and during that time, because he needed so many taxes raised all the time, he kind of really depended on Parliament, because Parliament controls the purse strings. They control how much money can be raised by the king. So Parliament grew a lot, and during this time it had to be organized into two different houses. The House of Lords, which of course is made up of the nobles, and the House of Commons, which is actually made up of obviously common men or non-nobility. And that's actually the way that Parliament is actually still organized today. In fact, our own government, the United States Congress, is modeled after this two-house model. We have instead of a House of Lords and House of Commons, we have the Senate and the House of Representatives, of course. And just like in Parliament, our Congress does control the purse strings, for better or for worse. But anyway, Edward III's grandson, Richard II, had to deal with a whole lot of drama and intrigue as well. Don't worry, by the way, about trying to keep track of all the different lineages and kings and queens. It's going to be way too complicated. More than anything, you kind of have to just understand the changes that take place as a result of events. But anyway, Richard II had to deal with a lot of peasant revolts during his time, especially in the aftermath of the Hundred Years' War and the plague and everything, and also a lot of really nasty cutthroat competition amongst the nobility of England. And one of the most famous of these is the story of the two families, the Lancasters and the Yorks, that engaged in civil war, and it's been called now the War of the Roses. That was actually a name given to it much later by Shakespeare. But in the end, the Lancasters won. Henry of Lancaster won, and he became Henry IV. By the way, if any of you watch Game of Thrones, the Lannisters and the Starks are modeled after the Lancasters and the Yorks. And if you do watch Game of Thrones, I would love to discuss it with you at any point after class. That's my favorite show. Okay, so that under this new dynasty, England is going to become an incredibly powerful monarchy, and we will come back to this a little bit later this year. For now, though, just know that England has a powerful king with a parliament that has this kind of precarious relationship with him. The more powerful the King of England becomes, the more paranoid and suspicious Parliament becomes as well. Okay, what about France, though? France actually had been the richest country, or richest monarchy, really, in Europe when the 14th century began. This is not unusual. And France is actually probably, out of every country in Europe, is probably the most, I guess you could say, obsessed with social classes and the rigidity of the old regime or the ancien regime, how people are organized. And the thing is that there had been this real lack of unity in France, and it had been divided into these several territories, some of them ruled by princes or kings from England, and sometimes even other foreign kings from Spain and from Italy. So France's borders back then didn't look like what they look like today. And a lot of these territories were ruled by these princes who competed with power very jealously with each other, and often even against the King of France himself. And for that reason, the King of France is going to, and not just this King of France, but basically until the French Revolution, the King of France is going to become this sort of figure in France that is known for guarding his power very, very closely and jealously. The French Parliament, France had a parliament too called the Estates General. If you ever studied the French Revolution, you've heard of them. And the French Parliament is called the Estates General, and they also helped Philip VI raise taxes during the war. But, you know, being the King of France, he really doesn't like this. He sort of sees the Estates General as sort of like an obstacle to him getting what he really wants, which is glory and victory. And he doesn't want to have to worry about things like the Estates General not giving him the money he wants. So later on, French kings from that point on, starting with Louis XIV, really are really going to undermine and in some cases completely get rid of the Estates General, in which we will be seeing the rise of absolute monarchies. Okay, what about Germany? So this is kind of a trick question because Germany didn't really exist, at least not the way it does today. So when we talk about German people or the German monarchy, we're talking about the area that is today known as Germany, where people speak a German language or Germanic-like language. But for the most part, Germany wasn't really Germany. Germany was part of something bigger called the Holy Roman Empire. So what exactly is the Holy Roman Empire? Well, here's a map, and as you guys can see, it takes up this huge bit of territory that expands all the way through not just Germany, but Austria, parts of Hungary, what is now the Czech Republic and Slovakia, Poland, the Netherlands, kind of stops just short of Denmark, and even a little bit into France. But the borders of the Holy Roman Empire were like really vague and often changing. The other thing too is that it's not really holy or Roman or an empire. When the Roman Empire fell apart, it kind of split in half, and the western half of the empire, which is basically everything from France or like everything west of Germany, kind of just broke up into like, you know, France and England, all these other different states. And then Italy kind of fell apart into all these other competing city-states. The only part of it that kind of like remained as a big, large chunk was this eastern part of it, and it kind of tried to retain this name of the Roman Empire, even though it's not in Rome or Italy at all. It was seen as holy because of its relationship to the Catholic Church. But it's a really strange situation, and we're going to get a little bit more into it later. Prague, which is in now the Czech Republic, was the capital of the Holy Roman Empire, and later it moved to Vienna. Okay, so the Holy Roman Empire, again, is like this really strange sort of configuration of countries that was changing all the time. So trying to keep track of it is sort of ridiculous. But this is what it looked like around 1500. As you can see, it makes up pretty much all of Eastern Europe and goes all the way even into Russia. And most of the people in the Holy Roman Empire considered themselves to be like often German-speaking or German, but then there were also Austrians and Hungarians and even Italians who were part of this. And they were all sort of under the rule of this one emperor. But even under that emperor, there were all these other princes, and they all spoke different languages and had different customs. So it was like this really strange thing. The Holy Roman Empire will be eventually shut down completely by Napoleon later on. Okay, so German, like in quotations. When the breakup of the what the breakup was, or the makeup of the Holy Roman Empire, it's really a collection of hundreds of states, most of them independent. But the one thing that ties them together is their obligation to the Holy Roman Emperor, who, of course, is Catholic. And what's interesting is that because it was made up of all these different states, and so many different royal families were involved in this, they decided to make the Holy Roman Emperor's position one that is actually elected and not inherited. And this was established by something called the Golden Bull. So it was Emperor Charles IV who actually comes up with this, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV. And a bull, by the way, is like a decree or a policy that is established by someone in authority, whether it's the Pope or an emperor. And he basically said that rather than inheriting the position, we're going to actually have a body of electors that is going to choose the next emperor, whose official title was actually King of the Romans. Again, very confusing because this is not anywhere near actual Rome at this point. And the electors were actually 4 princes, usually German, and 3 church or ecclesiastical rulers, usually bishops or archbishops, that lived within the Holy Roman Empire. The princes or kings of Germany were often seen as really weak, since the only way that they really had to retain their power was to marry into other royal families and have sons and then kind of continue their lineage. That was pretty much it. It wasn't like they had these strong national monarchies with these enormous armies like France or England did. Most of their power rested on who they married, which can be, as you can imagine, pretty debilitating. Okay, so that was Germany. We'll come back to them later since they are a little bit complicated. Another country that didn't exist really as a nation was Italy. Italy was not a state. Italy was just a geographic expression right here, as you can see in this map, that is made up of a collection of various city-states or regions. And northern Italy was very different from southern Italy. Northern Italy was wealthier, was really much more the heart of what would later on be the Renaissance. It was much more, I guess you could say, cosmopolitan and worldly, whereas southern Italy was known for being much more poor and sometimes even more violent, subjected to rule by other cultures. For example, the Papal States were really ruled by the Vatican, but also often invaded by the French. Naples and Sicily were taken over by Spain. So it was really the north of Italy that was like really Italy. You had Venice, which was a republic, and also very wealthy. And then the Duchy of Milan, ruled, of course, by a duke, and the Republic of Florence. So let's talk about these. Again, like I said, Italy was just a collection of kingdoms with a common language, but competing interests and princes, not an actual state. Both Italy and Germany will not actually unify and exist as the nations we know them today until 1870 and 1871. So we have a ways to go. Okay, so the states of Italy. First of all, you had Naples, which was ruled by the French House of Anjou and had at one point also been ruled by the Spanish. Naples was pretty poor, and since it was ruled by the French, they were basically subjected to French customs and French laws. Sicily was ruled now by Spain, by the Spanish House of Aragon, which probably sounds familiar because of Catherine of Aragon, who was at one point the mother-in-law of Henry VIII. Anyway, I'll get back to that later. Central Italy, again, the Papal States, they were pretty unstable because they were ruled by the Pope, or the papacy, I should say, the Vatican. But each of the city-states also had their own local control, so they kind of did their own thing. And there wasn't really, it was kind of like no one was really in charge and everyone was in charge. So it was really unstable in central Italy, which is where Rome was. And then there was the Duchy of Milan, which was ruled by a royal family, and the Republic of Florence, which was not really much of a republic. It was actually more of an autocracy that was run by some very wealthy families, primarily the Medici. And then you had the Republic of Venice. Venice was incredibly wealthy since it was one of the main trading ports in all of Europe, and its location was right smack in the middle of the Mediterranean with access to the Silk Road and the biggest trade routes, and then central, of course, to the rest of Europe. So in the 14th century in Italy, Republican governments really actually get replaced by tyrants. Especially in places like Florence and Venice, which are going to see the rise of some very powerful sort of mafia-like families that will take over these cities. And large city-states are going to take over the smaller ones. And in Italy, like I said, northern Italy was technically ruled by the Holy Roman Empire, but basically ran itself. It ran independently, even though it was technically sort of under the rule of the Holy Roman Empire. That's probably due to the fact that northern Italy was insanely rich because of all the merchants that resided there. There was a very powerful merchant class because of its location, right on the Mediterranean, easy access to the sea, to North Africa, to the Silk Road, and so on. And because later on many of these cities were ruled by tyrants, this of course is going to lead to war. Tyrants usually lead their uh, you know their cities or their states to war in an effort to try to one up each other. And these tyrants, sometimes they were just rich men who legitimized their rule by buying up royal titles. You could actually, if you had enough money, you could buy a royal title from the Holy Roman Emperor, like the same way that like it was like buying real estate. You could tell the Holy Roman Emperor, I want to be a duke, make me a duke, and you give him a certain amount of money, and voila, you were a duke. Suddenly you had noble blood. Because these men were so rich and they came from small city-states, they had to rely on mercenaries to fight their wars. Where did so many of their mercenaries come from? Here's a weird fact: Switzerland. Switzerland's main export at this point was mercenaries. Now, one of the things about the Italians, and if you've ever seen like mafia movies, this kind of sounds familiar. But because mercenaries were so important to these men, they needed these mercenary leaders that sold soldiers to the highest bidders, and these men were called condottieri. Interestingly, these condottieri, they're kind of like drug dealers, only instead of selling drugs, they're selling soldiers and weapons. This makes them incredibly powerful warlords, and suddenly Italy finds itself being run by these very powerful families with very important connections to other powerful people and warlords. That might sound familiar to you if you've ever seen anything like The Godfather. Anyway, by 1500, three of the states that dominated northern Italy were Milan, Florence, and Venice. So these states of Italy, even to this day, northern Italy remains much more wealthy and cosmopolitan than southern Italy. And that is something that has carried on ever since these times. Northern Italy has always sort of like been the leader, I guess you could say, of that country. Milan was ruled by this very powerful family called the Visconti family, who bought their title from the Holy Roman Emperor, and they became the Dukes of Milan. Florence, interestingly enough, also will be the birthplace of the Renaissance, but it was at first run by this very noble class called the Grandi. Grandi means big people in Italian. But soon, there was this wealthy merchant industrialist class. Florence was actually one of the first centers of the textile industry. People from Florence were known for their fashion, for the clothing that they wore, mainly because that if back then, if you wore any kind of clothing that came from Florence, you knew it was very high quality. And so Florence was sort of the fashion closet of Europe at the time, I guess you could say. And they were very famous for these incredibly high quality textile and luxury goods. For this reason, the wealthy merchant class, they were not noble, but they had money. And so they were called popolo grosso, which in Italian literally means fat people. Now, that doesn't mean that they were actually fat or overweight, but back then, being fat or overweight meant that you had a lot to eat, and having a lot to eat was a sign of having a lot of money. So these popolo grosso set up a republic that was run by 7 major guilds. Guilds are sort of like these groups, kind of like unions of entire industries. For example, there was like the jewelry guild that made all of the jewelry, and this included the artisans, the designers, the owners, and even the apprentices. There was the iron workers guild, I guess you could say, the architects guild, the wool makers guild, and so on. And they represented basically the interests of the richest people in Florence. There were some small artisan shopkeepers. These were people called like the little people, or popolo minuto in Italian. And they had a little bit of a role in government, but for the most part, they were pretty much shushed up by the wealthier people. And by 1432, that should say 1432, I'm so sorry. It was really run by this small merchant oligarchy that really ran the government behind the scenes, with this very wealthy family in charge. Particularly in Florence, it was the Medici. Okay, and last but not least, you've got the Republic of Venice, which, like I said, was incredibly wealthy from trade, and it was controlled by these incredibly wealthy merchant families and banking families as well. The, um, these families formed a great council of 200 very wealthy, powerful families. There was a Senate, which was the legislative body, and an executive branch too, called the Council of Ten. There was a duke as well, or he was often called the Doge, but he was just a figurehead, and all the action really happened with the Senate and the Council of Ten. Perhaps because they had the sort of checks and balances system, Venice also had the most stable government in all of Italy. We're going to be seeing, though, that Italy, northern Italy, because of its trade and its banking industry, is going to become also one of the wealthiest and therefore will be the birthplace of the Renaissance. In the next video lecture, and I think also my last one, we're going to talk about the decline of the church, how these powerful new governments of Europe now are going to be taking power away from the church, whereas the church once was the most powerful entity. It is starting to lose a lot of its power because its power comes from the faith of the people. And as it turns out, during a century of so many calamities, armies can keep you safe, not the church.